Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. My name's Sam Johnson. Impact Policy is a proud Aboriginal owned and led consulting firm. We work largely with the public sector around all the pieces of the policy puzzle: research, engagement, design, and evaluation. And before I go any further, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge country. I want to acknowledge that we are on country today. I want to pay my deepest respects to Aboriginal country, our elders past and present. I want to recognize that wherever you are consuming this content from today, whether visually or through audio, that you're consuming this content on country. And I'll pay my deepest respects to wherever you're on today and consuming this from as well. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and it was never ceded by treaty. Today, I'm excited to kick back and have a big yarn, much about that sort of stuff, really, when we talk about country, with someone who's pretty passionate and active in the language revitalisation space. So I might hand it across to my guest for today to introduce herself, tell the world a little bit about where she's from, what she's doing, and anything else from there.
Yeah, we are both Sam. Watched a lot of your stuff, long time fan. I too.
I knew there was one somewhere.
I too want to acknowledge country. Yi Vijigal Barai, Marang Naran Dangaigal. I pay my respects to this country and the old people have cared for this country since time immemorial. Nata Gulwanyang, Nata Birapai Dangari, Gurwawan Garlukban. I'm Gulwanyang, a proud Birapai Dangari woman. I'm speaking to you in Gatang, which is my language, and I work a lot in the language revitalisation space.
Yeah, beautiful. For people that are maybe listening along that are passionate about the language space or interested in the Aboriginal language space, can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like and what that means?
I guess like a lot of people tend to gravitate towards sort of like language delivery, language education, but there's so many roles with respect to the sector. And I think as there's a continued investment, there was just a recent announcement of over $50 million worth of funding, I think, at the federal level. I actually sit on a National Language Policy Partnership Group, the LPP.
Yep.
And it's a really interesting space, right? Because you're kind of sitting, I'm on it as a community representative, particularly of language revitalisation contexts. And there's some community reps there from like more immersion contexts where they're kind of looking at language maintenance. But for us, we're very much, we don't have first speakers. It's very much that language revitalisation. So there's a lot of work to sort of be done in that space. And with that kind of recent announcement of that funding, and then there's some ongoing funding as well. I think there's a 17 million ongoing funding after a certain amount of time. And it's probably the biggest investments that's happened, like with particular focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages in Australia. So with that policy partnership group, like there's 7 sort of key priority areas, one of which is legislation. We know in New South Wales, we have the Aboriginal Languages Trust, which is actually, a product of the legislation that was brought in here. So I wear a lot of hats in the languages space. I actually manage a team of 8 out at the Western Sydney Record Centre. And we're unearthing language and cultural material that's been held there since 1788. A lot of violence in the materials. So I guess success on that project, yes, it's improving the discoverability of the materials, the accessibility of the materials for community, particularly for languages revitalisation and culture revitalisation. Because we're not just, identifying language material, we're also identifying the cultural context by which language sits, because you can't separate language and culture, right, ever. Because it gives it meaning, it brings meaning to that. So, we're doing a lot of this work, and we're wrapping a lot of supports around the team that has to kind of go through this. But it's so important that it's First Nations people doing the work, that they're analysing the material. Because historically, I guess, we've had a lot of non-Indigenous sort of linguists, archive workers try and interpret these materials. And there's been a huge risk, I guess, in the language revitalisation space of almost recolonising our language. In a way, because it's non-Indigenous people interpreting that, and it shows up in our dictionary, like dictionaries and everything all the time. Like there are certain words that are sacred words that pertain to ceremony, but then they've been put into the dictionary as some sort of generic word, and then they're being used and socialized, and it's kind of lost the meaning. And that's what I mean by kind of recolonizing the language through revitalization, when it's only got a Western dominant kind of lens to the work. So I think it's really important that First Nations people are showing up in that archive space and reinterpreting the materials, even if they've already got those source materials that have produced the dictionaries. Revisiting those and reanalyzing those, I think, is really, really important work.
Mm. How heavy is that for you and the team?
Um, it's pretty heavy. We do smoking all of the time. I When I first got into the role, they didn't have a in the industry of the archivist sort of space or glam sector. They didn't have like a First Nations archive support kind of framework or anything. Like, how do cultural institutions actually prepare and are ready to receive First Nations archive workers to show up and do this work and support them in a
Yeah.
way where they can retain them, and they can show up to work as their kind of best selves.
Mm.
So I wrote one and actually engaged a lot of mob, particularly through the Indigenous Archivist Collective and a number of other kind of key people across cultural institutions to help me write that. And then I leveraged it to kind of develop a team wellbeing plan in a co-design kind of way. Once I brought my team on board, I was like, well, what does this look like for you? How do we interpret this framework for our team? What are the
Yeah.
activities that you need? So some of the things, for example, like we landed kind of 5 additional days of to attend a language and culture camp each year outside of rec leave, outside of
Mm.
because how do you show up authentic in these roles if you're not connected to language and culture yourself?
Definitely.
We also engaged the services of Yamara, which is they've just been an amazing support there. They provide a lot of counselling, one-to-one support counselling, but we also have collective care sessions kind of monthly
Mm.
online, and then we have 4 yearly on country as well. Things like funding elders to provide cultural support. I guess it's kind of whatever the team needs.
Mm.
I've just tried to sort or seek funding and resourcing to deliver on that.
I think it's a critical piece of working in that language revitalization or archive space, hey, that I imagine um, only mob really understand the significance of, in terms of the heaviness, the
Mm,
violence of it, and also that it can be triggering and
yeah,
traumatizing doing this work. I think I did a bit of stuff in the early days around the development of the trust, and I remember,
I heard.
I remember
Yeah.
coming to work on it. Like, the whole team was really excited, like, because it was, working around our language and revitalization, everything that we're so passionate about. And for once as well, in government, it wasn't around disadvantage discourses. It wasn't around close the gap and justice, imprisonment stuff and health, our people dying early. It was like, revitalization of our language and working with our communities. Couldn't be anything more passionate and positive. But then we started to realize the violence that emerges through that work when you start to connect to it and you start to realize the visceral impact of what you've lost when you're
Mm.
doing that heavy work around revitalization.
And it's lonely work.
Yeah.
Language work is lonely work, and it's hard work. And when you're doing it, obviously across language revitalization footprints, there's always these key leaders, right? And they're wearing so many hats, and they're running on the smell of an oily rag, and
Mm,
they're putting their all into it. They're living and breathing language every day, and there are people around them kind of almost tearing them down, and
yeah.
you know, and you question yourself sometimes in this space as well. And
Mm,
I guess we all kind of come together, particularly at our generational level, across footprints, across areas, and go, well, how can we support each other? How can I leverage the resources that you've got? How can we
mm,
share
mm,
our ideas? How are you doing that? How are you engineering those words? How are you doing
yeah.
that? So we're constantly in conversation with each other and trying to set up networks and strength and keep each other going and keep each other engaged in this space and support each
Mm.
other. But yeah, we wear a lot of hats. So I teach language as well. Like, I use my nights. I've got 6 kids, but I try and I
Yeah.
try and make time as
Plenty of time,
well.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm teaching them language as well. I'm trying to raise
Yeah.
them up. They're all got language names. We do it, all
Mhm.
about well, it's not, I didn't name them. It's actually in our family group. It's the Ngapigan. So it's the
Mm-hmm.
mother's mother that gets the honor of naming the children. So I'm like, if you don't like your
Mm.
name, you're going to have to take it up with your grandmother. Like,
Yeah.
kidding. But like, I just think that, you know, revitalization through practice, through our family groups, like I live off grid as well, out in the bush, on country. That's how I wanted my babies raised, in language and culture, and us
Mm.
actually walking our talk and practicing it every day. And I have to teach, like I have to keep teaching language because I'm one of the only kind of educators in our area. Like we're really
Mm.
skinny on, but while I'm doing that, I'm also bringing the upcoming educators with me. So then once they're kind of, you know, feeling confident enough in the space, I can just take that step back, and then that's the model I want them to use as well, right?
Mm.
To then build
Mm.
capacity among other mob to do that. I manage a local language Aboriginal corporation as well, Gatanga Wakura, and
I think
that's,
that's when we first connected. I think I
yeah,
jumped on a call and you were talking to the work you were doing in that sort of space a few
yeah,
years ago now.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's our corporation. We just registered that like formally this year, but we had a group, Jugal Wakata, which might have been the one
I
that I
think
was
so.
yarning about. That was a more like voluntary kind of group
Mm.
of people coming together in the northern kind of Birapai footprint, in a voluntary capacity. And I just secretary that group. I mean, my job really is just to hold space for them to come together and provide opportunities, I guess, for us to be strong. Because it's one thing to learn language, it's another thing to know how to teach language and teach it
Mm.
effectively.
Mm. Mm.
And I have a bit of a mantra, even when I'm teaching language, is that it's not enough for me to teach other people language. I need to teach them how to teach language, because
Mm.
if I'm not doing that every step of the way, then I'm not building the army, right? That's going to come
Absolutely.
afterwards, and there's not going to be sustainability in that space.
Mm. I remember, I think, you know, people listening along, I think for one sort of core sort of thing I hope they understand and take away is not just the significance of the work that you're doing, um, but also like how sensitive it is and critical it is for our people to be leading that work.
Mm,
Um, and you know, you talked about the space historically of non-Aboriginal, you know, whether it's linguists or researchers in those sorts of spaces, really um, centering the narrative and records and revitalization, you know, of language and that sort of stuff. Whereas what we're seeing now is our people, you know, or our people from those countries being the center. And it's not to say that linguists and researchers don't have a space in the journey,
yeah,
but
that's
then
right.
they're no longer central to the narrative of where we're going from here.
Yeah.
Is that fair in terms of
Yeah,
where we're going?
absolutely. That's an incredibly fair comment. So I'm like frequenting spaces all the time. So I was only just recently, I was at the Australian Languages Workshop, and we are kind of presenting there. And, you know, I think there's this real fear among non-Indigenous linguists that have gotten a lot of capital over the years working with our languages and being leaders in that space, to now see a lot of Black linguists upcoming, a lot
Mm,
of us being empowered in implied linguistics, being able to speak
mm,
their language around our own languages, and really challenging some of the narratives that have been in that space.
mm.
I make a kind of a bit of a concerted effort to go to the Australian Linguistic Society conference every year
Yeah,
and present something
yeah, good.
challenging. So last year I did power, place, and space. So knowing how to check your power, knowing how to navigate space,
Mm,
and know your place when you're
mm,
working with language revitalization communities, and what that looks like. And I remember this moment when I was giving that presentation in the room, and I got everyone to look around the room and tell me how many Aboriginal people were in that room
mm,
with
mm,
them, why they were here talking about Aboriginal languages and all the work they were doing in our space.
mm.
And they were just deer in headlights type
Yeah, I bet.
moment. Um, and I guess that was the whole idea of the presentation, was to get them to think about, well, why are they here presenting on our
Mm,
languages
mm,
without the people of which are connected to those languages in the
mm.
room with them? Why were they not enabling them to come with them? And why
Yeah,
weren't they standing next to them? If you're so good in terms of what you're doing and the relationships you're building, show us.
that's it. That's it.
Yeah.
I think I always remember this quote, and I came across it on on Facebook of all the places for great research and information. But it was this quote, and it was about people working in research. But I think the quote is relevant to language and archives and all that sort of stuff. But it said the difference between, I'm going to paraphrase it, I'll probably get it wrong, but it said the difference between non-Aboriginal and, or it was, non-Indigenous and Indigenous people working in research or in archives is that when Aboriginal people read or come across that content, they feel the words in their bones. It was something like that, and it just really resonated with me, like on a visceral level, because that's what I was feeling in that language space. It was like, it wasn't what I was reading, it was like what was inside that it was invoking.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
So one of my other passion areas is genomics.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I really love the field of epigenetics and, concepts of blood memory. And when we speak our languages and we show up in culture, it does. It unlocks things within our own self, almost on a physical level that, kind of activates things with us. It's kind of like that deja vu, right? Have you ever had deja vu?
Yeah.
But it's like, you've never been there before. You've never experienced that before. You might be out in the bush. You might be speaking language. And it's like this instant, deep sense of knowing where you do. You feel it in your bones. You connect with it on a whole nother level. And I guess for like a lot of non-Indigenous linguists and people who are working in the field, it's very much here. It's very much othered. It's over here. It's a job. They don't have that same sense of connection, that same sense of care that's kind of needed in this space, that same type of passion and drive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember we put together the first languages gathering when the trust first came together, and the team that worked on that, like all black team, and conferences and gatherings are hard enough as it is anyway, but the layer was different. The cultural layer to the weight of people working on that project was so much more heavier because it was that layer of responsibility, accountability, back to our communities and language groups that were going to be there and be a part of that what happened was successful or was done well.
That integrity, hey, it's
absolutely.
so important. Like I've worked in the public service now for nearly 20 years, and I think the only thing that's kept me in the space is integrity. At any point, if I've ever felt my integrity be compromised, I've moved. So I have very much values driven, vocational driven. All my jobs have got to do with language and culture. I just live and breathe it. So yeah, I think when I do experience incongruence in terms of values, that's when I know it's time to go. It's time to move on.
Absolutely.
There's such a shortage of competent black fellas in the space that the world's our oyster. There's so many opportunities.
Totally. Yeah. So you mentioned almost 20 years in the public sector.
Yeah.
Congratulations for I think I did about 5. But and then you mentioned the Aboriginal Languages Workshop last year, and we were supposed to present impact policy, and I think I can't remember why we weren't there. I was unwell. Can't remember what it was. The whole team had that flu that was going around. It floored us.
I remember that one.
Floored us. Anyway, I'm getting triggered thinking about it. But what we were supposed to present on was around Aboriginal language use guidelines for the public sector, because what we could see, in my early journey with the trust and then working since then, was this real thirst for using language. Demand.
We call it demand in
big
our
demand.
footprint. Yeah.
But little sort of guidelines around how do you navigate this? What is appropriate? What is proper? What's essential? And all that sort of space. Can you talk to that sort of stuff a little bit?
Absolutely. So in our language governance group, our local one, Gulwanyang, we get a lot of requests come in all the time for translation work. And some of them are hard. I remember this one time we got one from a science department. And so like Bitapai mob, our totem is Goyawan, the grey nose shark, right? That's our kin, that's our Gimbai. And they wanted us to name all these animals in jars. And I remember seeing this image of this Goyawan And we were like, okay, do we do this language request? And we actually said, no, we're not going to do this because it actually goes against our kind of cultural integrity. We're not. So we kind of really have a good yarn, a good unpacking as to, are we going to honor? Are we going to do this? Are we going to apply our language to this? And I guess that demand that you're talking about places this significant pressure on us, because as much as we do that translation work for all these entities and do all of that work, it's actually taking away that direct investment into our own mob to grow our own speakers, our own teachers. So, we're under resources as it is. It's really tough on us. So that increase in demand, sometimes it's like this unintended consequence of socializing language and everyone getting really excited about language in government, in different sectors,
Totally.
and they just want.
Totally.
And it's like, whoa. I think we've kind of got this term that we say in language, but it means in our own time and place, in our own time and place. So it's about holding people off so we can continue to invest into our own people first, grow our speakers, grow our teachers, and then we can be more responsive in a sustainable way to some of that external kind of demand. But people just want language and they commodify it, and it's like this voyeurism as well, and it's just like for the purpose of having language. So when we do language requests, we don't just give them language. We will say, we'd like to do a workshop with you. So if it's the naming of a centre or a naming of something, we'll actually go out and work with their staff and say, well, rather than us just give you language, what do you want to call it? And we tend to do some co-design kind of workshops around doing maybe a custom acknowledgement of that space and place. Like, what does it mean to them? How do they, want to show up in that space? And then we will provide the language. And then we also provide recordings of the language as well. People sometimes tend to do like this, try to do this like English phonetic breakdown, but if 10 people walk past and read that, they interpret it 10 different ways and it never works, right? So we're big into recording the QR code thing. So it's got some sustainability there.
Great.
And then we also offer education for staff. How are we going to get you to pronounce this appropriately, announce this appropriately, and that cultural unpacking as well, because language just isn't language, right? It has layers. It's got cultural yarns behind every single word in our language. There's all this layered meaning. So if we just provided the language, no meaning, no connection, all of that. So I think it's so important that we're providing all these other things around it. So we think about what impact each one is going to have. And where we want to actually invest our resourcing at that time.
It's an interesting yarn. Like, I particularly think about it, like we're here in Sydney City today, and we work, you're at public sector, state government. We work, probably for the most part with state government, and you see the complexity around language use, whether it's naming projects in language, naming buildings in language, rooms in language, a whole range of different things around that, and so you see stuff around like different countries' language being used off country, and a lack of process or protocol around whether that's appropriate, and the damage that can do for country and even for language use as well, and how does that like what damage can that do in terms of the broader understanding of our languages for everybody? You know what I mean? Like if Martin Place has got a room in Gulwanyang, then, and somebody who's walking in there is seeing those language words and then starts to associate that language with this country, the impacts on that in terms of broader understandings of language revitalisation starts to get really impacted, as opposed to bringing it back to country and community having that autonomy and ownership over making those decisions around what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and things like that too. But coming back to yourself and your experience, you've probably seen that happen a range of different times throughout your almost 20-year journey, right? Can you, like, thinking broadly and, not naming places or, putting people on show, but have you seen examples of what you think is good practice, or maybe examples of what you think could have been done better?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, this is a tricky one because it happens so often, right? And I guess that's why, like with our local language governance group, we do that culture unpacking,
Mm,
because we don't just want to socialize our language and have it visibly, publicly. We actually want people to understand that language is inextricably, like intrinsically, I guess, linked to country.
mm,
You can't separate the two. Mind you, when I teach language, I actually teach it online to a lot of mob off country
mm,
because I
mm.
think they've got a right to
Absolutely.
learn their language. But yeah, making sure that the languages of that country, I think, is really, really important.
Mm,
And yes, there are examples, but they're products also. Those some of the examples that I do have are products of, being moved on to reserves, being moved on to missions, and having some of our old people in my own family group even grow up on places like Burnt Bridge, and grow up with an amalgamation of languages all around them. So
mm,
it's tricky. So when we're
mm,
doing this work in Gatang, and we've got all this reference material, we've got this reliability of these words, and we're putting them into a dictionary, and we're starting to grow our speakers and teachers again in this space. Some of our old people, like, there's this spectrum of experience, right? So some of them like outright reject it and say that's not our language
mm-hmm.
because they've grown up with like Gomroy or Tangari
Yep.
or some of those other ones that have been on this mission and reserve. No, 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 that's not our word for
Mm,
that. That's
mm,
this. I'm like, no, that's a Tangari word.
mm.
And like having to have those conversations with people that I perceive to be knowledge holders within my family group, like that's tricky. It's a
Yeah,
tricky space to
absolutely.
navigate as a younger person in my family group. So a lot of sometimes the products of these things isn't just necessarily government. Some of it's our own people that have,
Mm,
you know, grown up with an amalgamation of words and thinking that this is this.
totally.
Um, and it's tricky. You have to navigate that space really, really gently because there's that spectrum of emotion. Like you've got the outright rejection of the language. Sometimes elders, like if they hear language, they cry.
Mm,
Um, some of them
mm,
get quite angry as
mm,
well. Like we've got this beautiful choir at home, Ngagan Miran, and we sing in language. It's our women and our girls,
mm,
and yeah, there's a spectrum of emotion, of responses to some of that, particularly among our old people when we do
mm.
sing for them.
Absolutely. I can
Yeah.
imagine. It makes me it makes me think about the complexity around who can learn language.
Mm.
And I think that example, particularly of our old people, um, makes me think about when non-Aboriginal people are learning language. Because there's been conversations, around who can learn language, who can't learn language,
Mm.
um, and different things like that. And I'm sure there's many people that are listening and watching this right now that maybe are learning or would love to learn an Aboriginal language. And um, I remember hearing stories around, our old people going to language classes who don't know their language
Mm-hmm.
and are being taught by non-Aboriginal people,
Mm-hmm.
or having non-Aboriginal people in those classes, that might be younger or, maybe even the same generation, but speaking their language before they can. And the triggering that could be,
Mm-hmm.
or the impact of that. And I think it's just a layer to that conversation, and there's a nuance around how we explore that and talk to that. But what are
Mm-hmm.
your sort of views around people learning language, mob, not
Yeah.
mob, and all that sort of, being a teacher as well?
So we got some really strong protocols across Bitapai.
Mm-hmm.
So we're like this northern Bitapai governance group, but there's a southern one as well. And we kind of very much stay in our lanes because we're geographically located in a way that we can respond to some of those requests that's more targeted in terms of our footprint,
Mm-hmm.
the area of our footprint. But one thing that we've really focused on in the last kind of 10 years is forming a really close relationship, making sure we're on the same page when it comes to protocols.
Mm.
And that's a lot of the work that does need to be done in that language revitalisation space is the relationships and
Mm.
making sure you're starting to get some consistency across your footprint about where you stand on things with respect to some of the questions that you're asking.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, to be a Gatang educator, you have to be Bitapai Watamai or Guringai. You actually have to have a bloodline to educate other people in our language. Because how do you do that cultural unpacking if you have no connection to that country whatsoever?
Absolutely.
You're not going to be able to honour the language in the way it actually needs to be honoured and taught and shared with other people. The other aspect to that is they have to have like a Cert 3 level of knowledge of language or higher. And that means understanding the grammatical features of our language. So even if you're teaching like, early education, even if you're teaching like Cert 1 or very beginners in community, it's really important you still have a much higher understanding of the language to have that delivery. And the third one is that they're endorsed by a local language governance group, so they're actually recognised as as somebody of that community, and they've got that endorsement letter. And when we endorse our educators, it's only for a certain period of time, so it's usually about 2 years. Because you can be an endorsed educator, you can move off country, go up to Queensland, be up there for 10 years, and then expect to come back and teach language. You need to reconnect again, and we need to make sure that that proficiency is kind of still there, and you're able to do that. So we don't have non-Indigenous people teach language across our footprint, which is the only footprint I actually have speaking rights on.
Absolutely.
It's not my place.
Important point for
it's
people
not my
listening
place
to
have be critical of other areas. I mean,
definitely.
That's up for them and their relationships
Absolutely.
across their footprint and what they've decided on. And I respect their decision making. And yeah, I often get sitting rights on other people's countries, but not speaking rights, and I don't purport to. So I can only really speak to my footprint, and that's what we're kind of doing. We've kind of stayed out of schools a bit. Because we wanted to really invest in community first, and we want to grow our own speakers and teachers first to be responsive to that education kind of setting. And then when we do go into schools, early education spaces, we teach all children in language, but we'll have breakout kind of spaces just for Aboriginal students or children, so we can dive deeper into some of the identity stuff and some of the other cultural layers that might come with language. But when it's the whole group, we keep it at a certain kind of level. But I think that's really important, because if we don't bring non-Indigenous kids along on the journey with us, well, what does our future look like? Being only this percentage of the population, how do we get them to deeply care for country, to deeply understand our culture? And I think language is a really important vehicle, an important mechanism to be able to do that.
That's right. And I think that's a really important point that you make around that future generation and that connection to caring for country, and language as a vehicle for that. I think everybody has a connection to country, but as blackfellas, we have a custodianship to country. And I think you're exactly right. Like language is that vehicle for, this next generation of young people to really help strengthen their connections and how they work alongside our people and country to care and, support that journey moving forward.
Absolutely.
You talked about, I love that, how you talked about the process in terms of when people come and hungry demand for language, and how you just go through a bit of a co-design journey, or there's a bit of a process around access to that language and use of, and how you get there. Because I loved hearing that, because so often my experience has just been someone's plucked something out of a dictionary, or they've asked the one blackfella that works in their organisation that isn't even from that country to suggest a language word. Not to even start talking about the harm that puts that staff member into, and the appropriateness of that. But I loved the process that you mob have embedded, because I think like that's really critical for people listening in this public-private sector space that are interested in access to language and use of it as part of projects, spaces, places, whatever, is really understanding that it is a relationship based with country and with people that have authority to be able to do that work.
And we make that really clear in our language request form. So we've got it on our kind of website there. There's a language request form. It's got all of our ISIP statements in there.
Yeah, great.
So we dive really, really deep into this is what you can expect when you engage with us.
What's ISIP for anyone listening?
So it's
No, you're right.
Indigenous cultural intellectual property, and language actually fits within kind of some of that arts kind of law stuff. In fact, when we wanted to get advice about how to apply ISIP, within our languages space, we actually went to kind of the arts law website and requested, some free advice from a lawyer who actually helped us with our statements.
Yeah, wow.
And we make it very explicit that we're only licensing the language to them, and at any point we can actually ask them to not use it.
Yeah.
Particularly if they don't maintain integrity around the language.
Yeah.
And they're only allowed to use it for that instance by which we provide it. They're not to use it in any other context, because the context by which we provided the language really related to how they requested it, and the way it was approximated in that instance. But if then they go and grab that language and go and use it over here for something else, then it might not apply in terms of the meaning that's required there. So it needs that cultural lens again. It needs to be revisited again, and another request needs to come through. And we do step out, like, we're not just going to give you the language. We may, in instances, ask that you engage one of our educators, do this, the ABC that we were kind of talking about before as well. Just, it's all about maintaining the integrity of the language for us. And in a revitalisation context, that's actually really important, particularly with archival work and some of that other work. If you're using a certain word for a period of time, and then you unearth another word that is more relevant to a context, then we want to make sure we can circle back on things and actually change that to make sure we're honouring our language in a sustainable way.
Absolutely.
And I think entities requesting language need to be respectful of that. They need to be respectful of our process, our space, and just be patient with us.
Absolutely. I think, I love so much of what you said there. I think for me, I was at the Planning Institute of Australia's National Congress in Melbourne earlier in the year. And, it was great staff, range of designers and people working in that planning lens. But there was this company that were doing a presentation around all their housing developments over like the last 20 years. And they're talking through, maybe I think 6 or 7 different developments they talked through. But what I noticed is all the developments in like the last 5 years all started to have language names for the buildings. And I remember sitting there and thinking exactly the sort of stuff that you're talking to in terms of what's the process, who's given the authority. But what I love about what you talk to is actually making sure that our communities and our people that have those authorities have agency in terms of the use of that language. And that I think a lot of what you're talking to comes back to the fact that access to language as well for a big part, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in those sorts of settings, it needs to be recognized that it's not a transaction, it's a relationship.
That's right.
And you've been maybe gifted this language for a particular purpose at this point in time, but you don't own that language.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I agree. And I think a lot of that activity and the revenue we generate off that activity, now that we're a corporation, we can actually continue to reinvest that in like a cyclical kind of way back into our educators. So about 4 times a year, we also have a Gatang Language Educator Day, where we'll invite people to share how they're delivering language and leave resources in that space, so we can grow our educators and grow them really strong in their delivery, in their toolbox of techniques on how they deliver language as well. So our model is very much kind of premised on this like reinvestment. How do we invest in ourselves, in our community, in our own growth? Where do we want to see ourselves, in X amount of time, and how do we get there together? Very strengths-based, strengths-focused. Anything that's not agreed on gets parked, and, we can always circle back to those things later on. We had family groups that wouldn't even be in the same room as each other at one point across our footprint. But once we focus on language, and we focus on revitalisation, and we focus on our babies and our babies' babies, and we really remember what's important, they're in the same room now. We're driving language forward. We're able to work together. But that takes time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's one of those critical pieces, hey, is bringing it back to the journey that we're on and where we're going. That's what Kieran and I was yarning about, you know, when I said that we just started talking about language organically at the start of our yarn, and he was saying about his journey and, you know, how he doesn't speak yet, and
he will be next year when he
that's
gets into
it.
my class.
Shout out, Kieran.
I'm already
Can't hide,
enrolling him.
But we talked about the fact that, like, where we are right now in this point in time, in terms of what our parents lost or was taken away from them, or our grandparents, you know, what we get back in our lifetime now might not be, you know, it might not never be what we had hoped we'd get to, but it's that patience that it's for, you know, for him, it's for Malia, for me, it's for Ewan, that they are now starting when they're our age, miles ahead of where we were, you know,
That's
and
right.
that their children are going to be, you know, it's that foresight for us in terms of getting the right people in the room and centering that how we navigate challenge and move forward together, is that it's not really about who's in this space, it's about who's going to be sitting here, you
That's
know, when we're
right.
gone.
Who's coming after us?
That's it.
And I think it's an oversight that's happened sometimes generationally, is not bringing the next gen along on the journey. So it's something I've certainly been mindful of within what I do, because I'm like, yeah, who's gonna take up this work? So that capacity building piece with your own mob, the younger mob, making sure they're coming behind you, and you're really building their capacity, I think is really important. We've seen a lot of it, I think, in the activist movement as well. So there was like this really staunch like generation, and then there wasn't a lot of thinking, I don't think, into how do we bring the next generation through and have them really well educated. And I think even what we're seeing now among a lot of our young people is like a lack of understanding of, you know, Black history, Black politics. We're almost having to kind of start again, like some of the conversations or dialogue that I've been having, you know, with young people on
Absolutely.
social media today. I'm like, how do you not know this? Like, how are you in a Black family group and you're not
100%.
being raised in this? So I don't want that to happen in the language space. I want to make sure that every generation behind me, the next one, they're all being brought along. They know what capacity building looks like. They've seen it modeled to them. You know, and that's what I'm trying to do, is grow people, and then in with all those hats, and then step away once they're right. They're right. You know, it's the only way that we can really do it. We've got a saying in our language, and it's marbula balbul, and it means the next seven again. So it means whatever we do now, it's not about us. It's not about the here and now. It's about the next one, the next one, the next one, in terms of the generations. So if we're always thinking sustainably, we're always thinking ahead, that capacity building is just happening naturally all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that 7 generations sort of space. I think it's one that gives us a lot of resilience and patience to keep navigating and moving forward. You know, I think there's so much work that needs to happen. It's critical as well right now, but I think also understanding that even within this generation, we have made significant, you know, steps forward. And if we continue with that lens of, you know, still keeping the urgency and the momentum moving, but, you know, reimagining what this next generation, the generation after, how we keep progressing with that energy and momentum is going to be, I think that helps us when those times are heavy and tough, you know, and things like that. Or, you know, when we pick up archives and things like that, and it is a heavy day, you know, that we understand and take strength from where we are and where we're going to.
Absolutely. I think that straddling of that sense of urgency, but in our own time and place, is something that can be really tricky in terms of the balance, because you've got like this, we really need to get our language back, you know, but we also need to do it well. We also need to do it properly. We also need to not recolonize our language and have English thinking, English Western application on how we do that work.
Yeah.
Because it sneaks in if you're just focused on the urgency.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. if you could give advice to people listening now, that maybe work, like maybe they're non-Aboriginal professionals, maybe they work in the public sector, maybe they're in the private sector, and they want to use language as part of their work, or they want to engage in language in some way as part of their work for whatever it is that they're doing, what would you say, just generally, are some of the critical things that they need to think of before they start to do that sort of stuff?
I think understanding context is really important because there's so many different contexts across this continent.
Mm.
So there's immersion context where they're really focused on maintenance of language.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be totally different to the needs, the considerations in a language revitalisation context. Definitely being patient and holding space. Sometimes those relationships need to happen over time, and we've got to just sometimes the role in that instance in government isn't to be demanding. It's actually just to hold space for some of that stuff to kind of organically and naturally occur, or provide space or opportunities for that to kind of those relationships to occur.
Yeah,
I think about the
absolutely.
Sydney area when I
Yes.
say some of that.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
And yeah, I think just understanding the context, understanding the space, understanding kind of where they're at, and sometimes language isn't always for you. It's not always. Some things shouldn't have language applied to it as well,
Yep.
and just accepting that that's language isn't always going to be just offered up to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's some really critical points for people to hear and take away. I think that last one, yeah, not everyone has a right to language, to expect access, to expect use of and for based on their own agendas. I think that's an important point for people to understand as part of starting to think about that sort of space.
But
And
if there's opportunities for those people to learn language and that's
yeah,
offered to them because of where they live or where they work, I think it's really important for them
mm,
to take up those opportunities, engage with it. I know, like, there's these beautiful Darug sisters, right?
mm,
Jazzy and Karina, and they'll they deliver language to everyone, non-Indigenous people as well. They actually, a few members of my team that are non-Indigenous participate in the Darug program there,
mm,
and their ability to be able to show up in the work. One of them's a conservator that conserves paper-based
yep,
materials, a very lab coat
yeah,
science one,
yep,
and she's loving it. She's absolutely thriving.
mm,
And so when she's working with these materials or speaking to them, when we bring people in for tours or having a look at the project, she can really show up in that because she's got this
absolutely.
much deeper understanding of
Mm,
what's the importance of this work, and speaks with such passion.
yeah, I love that.
So it's not to say that it's not for
Absolutely,
non-Indigenous people at all. It's just
absolutely.
respecting the space and knowing if you've got place in that space, and
Mm.
just navigating it respectfully.
Definitely. And then I think the other one that I really liked, I think it was the second part that you said around time and
Mm.
relationships, and that sometimes, like, so if you're working in the public or private sector, and you're, say you're building a skyscraper and you would ideally love a language name across the top of it, for example, um, that the journey to get to there
Mm.
depends on really meaningful relationships and a journey that you would go on with um, the country and community that language would be from, where that development might be happening, and that might take a significant period of time. And I think for people listening to just not think about our languages as like a transaction,
Mm.
and that that it comes from country, and that your access to it is really based on really meaningful relationships, and a protocol or a process that you go on with people that have that authority to do that work with. I think um, I might be misinterpreting how
No,
you
you're
spoke to
bang
that, but
on.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think,
absolutely.
it's hard for people to hear, because maybe particularly if you're in the government space, everyone wants it yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and so sometimes that's a hard pill to sort of swallow. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you feel friction or pushback from community, sometimes maybe it's not necessarily sometimes even around whether it's appropriate or not in terms of access or use, but maybe it's just that the circumstances or parameters you're putting around the process is not appropriate.
Yeah, and it can also just be timing as well. Like I
Mm,
said, really under-resourced.
Yeah.
We're really having to pick and
Yeah.
choose where our energy is going at the moment.
Exactly.
With our footprint. So yeah,
Mm.
and we're kind of begging and borrowing when it comes to
Totally.
absolute, like, you know, resourcing in terms of funding and that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's it, right? Like, we're not talking about, you know, people that are listening, like, you're probably understanding, if you're new to sort of thinking about this language sort of space, that, you know, the real investment into language revitalisation has only really been significant in the last 3 to 5 years. And many of our people doing the work on the ground and in community are still doing that unpaid, or if paid, you know, like they're not doing it as part of full-time, you know, careers that invest in doing that sort of work. And so there is a significant sort of part of that journey that is going to take time, because people are like yourself are wearing a multitude of hats, and all that sort of stuff as well. And so don't just think that there's these community infrastructure language centers that exist everywhere, or whatever you might want to call it, where people, that's all their job is to work with you to navigate this. It will look different from country to country and
Yeah.
and
Even
community.
where there are language centres, like, they're really under-resourced, they're struggling themselves, particularly
Absolutely.
to meet the needs of the footprints they purport to support. So yeah, it's tricky. They tend to be regional. They tend to be supporting multiple language groups, and they've got to kind of pick and choose where their energy is going. And
Yeah.
you know, that can be tough for some of the ones that might not get the levels of support they need. So yeah, I think it's really important that they're building capacity across footprints. I think we've done that a lot, like by doing the corporation, is to how do we stand on our N2V? How
Yeah.
do we invest in ourselves? How do we build our own strength? How do we get our own linguists? So we're not relying on those spaces. And that doesn't mean language centers don't exist then. It just means their role kind of changes, right? From being like this lead direct investment sort of role to now just taking that step back and going, well, how can we support you
Yeah.
and work in partnership with you? And I think
Absolutely.
that's the same with linguists. Like, a lot of those non-Indigenous linguists, we're not taking their jobs.
Yeah.
We're not
Totally.
taken over.
Yeah. That's it.
Your role's just changing now, and it's not so much like a lead role. You might not get as much capital, you might not have as much
Yeah.
power,
Yep.
but there's also power in relinquishing power with us.
Absolutely.
And working with us. So I think it's just the nature of the relationship that changes, and people are scared of change. People fear that, particularly if you've had capital and power in a place for
Yeah.
so long.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of identity and different things are wrapped up in
Yeah,
those.
but there's a lot of beauty that
Those.
comes out of changing your
Absolutely.
role as well. It's like parenting, right?
Yeah.
A little bit, like, you know, oh, you can dress yourself now. Okay,
Yeah.
the nature of me being a parent actually needs to change. I need to change and grow as you build your capacity to be able to do
Yes.
these things for yourself. So I kind of see it a little bit like
Yeah,
that. That's
yeah,
a
yeah,
weird
yeah.
correlation,
Yeah.
but
Totally.
yeah,
Totally.
yeah,
You mentioned that you sit on the Language Policy Partnership,
I do.
a few different things like that. What do you sort of see as, you know, one or two of the main sort of priorities at the moment, broadly, when we're thinking about policy and language, at a state or federal sort of level, or anything like that for people listening?
I'm going to be a little bit shocked by this answer for myself,
Yeah.
because legislation is one of them. I mean, look at the runs that we've been able to get on the board in New South Wales. When I sit at that language policy partnership and I see all the jurisdictions and they're giving their updates around the table, and New South Wales speaks,
Yeah.
like
Okay.
the runs that they are getting on the board with respect to supporting language revitalisation communities on the ground here is massive,
That makes feel good.
and
Yeah.
a really stark contrast to what's happening in the other states. It's a great model in New South Wales. I think the only thing kind of missing in this footprint is maybe a languages peak, like a lead, particularly with respect to Target 16 under closing the gap. So you've got the trust, but you need kind of almost like this community lead that's supporting those
Yeah.
corporations on the ground, that's building capacity. You know, I really love impact evaluation and how do they measure their activities and what kind of impact they're making on the ground.
Totally.
It's something we're constantly thinking about with all of our activity in our language spaces. Yeah, how do we measure this? How do we measure its success? So we can see our growth over so many years and be able to reflect back on that. So I think it's really unique in New South Wales compared to some of the other jurisdictions. But if they were able to kind of model almost some of the stuff happening here, with respect to, and I think legislation is the enabler at a state. I'm not so sure about a federal legislation and having like a commissioner or something, but that might even elevate the status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages here. We're in the UNESCO decade of Indigenous languages at the moment, so globally we're probably getting a little bit more traction, a little bit more attention in the space as well from a policy perspective. But legislation, I think collections, only because like I work in collection, I know how important that space is. Bringing language home to the people is really a top priority as well. I think some of the translation and interpreter kind of services so I'm thinking very much collections in the revitalisation context, right? But when I think about that language maintenance context, or I think about communities where English isn't a first language, they're growing up in language, they're real staunch in language still. How are they accessing education, health, the justice system if they don't have good translators and interpreters? I mean, it's a human right to have those services, to have those supports, have access to those things, but we're not even delivering on, the basic fundamental kind of human rights of those people.
Totally.
In that space. So I think that's a really high priority as well. Even though it's not as relevant to my particular context, I think it's still incredibly relevant.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, for people that are listening, New South Wales is the only state in the country that has legislation into recognising and investing into the revitalisation of languages across New South Wales, and one of the few in the world, hey?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think in the early stages of the trust, we did a bit of work with the mob in British Columbia, because they were doing a stack of like really great work. They were almost like much further along the journey in terms of the trust sort of style of developmental work that they were doing, but they didn't have legislation. So like they had investment into this space, but no real legislative protections around the work that they were doing too. But it's amazing to hear about how you can see the runs on the board that New South Wales is managing to achieve, as opposed to different parts of the country, with legislation there as an enabler for that investment. I think it just speaks to the significance of if we can support the investment into our countries and our communities, the impact that we can have, at a local level for language.
Hopefully language just takes off. And we're just living and breathing it.
Yeah, that's
We're walking down the street and we're hearing people speaking language.
Totally.
That's the dream, right?
100%. Coming towards the end of our time together for today, I could kick back and just, talk about language for hours. I love listening. And is there any final sort of thoughts or messages or anything that you want to leave for anyone that might be watching or listening along?
Yeah, I think for our young people, like, you can have a job in languages. You can be in this space. I just want to see that fire in the belly of our young people to really want to step into the space, be in this space. There's opportunity for leadership. A language sector is being built as we speak.
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot more kind of coming, a lot more opportunity coming. And I guess, really want to see that doesn't matter what sector you work in, whether it's health, education, justice, there are language jobs. You don't have to go work in mining to get paid. You can show up in language and culture and have integrity. I just want to see that fire in the bellies of our young people in this space.
Mad. Well, thank you for that. I think that's I think that final message really is a bit of a thread for different themes that came up throughout our yarn together around our young people and the next generations moving forward. I want to take a moment to thank you for taking the time out of your day to come here. And I want to really acknowledge again the work that you're doing in the language space, and for people listening to really understand that whilst it's work that we are passionate about, and is really critical work, it can also be very heavy work too. I want to hold space, acknowledge, and thank you for doing that work for the generations to come as well. So thank you so much.
Marongbo, and I say yibu, it's nothing. I'm obligated. Growing up in a family group where I'm obligated. So
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you so much.
Marongbo, thanks, Sam.